Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Wherever you are around the world, I'd like to welcome you to this Chartered Banker webcast in honour of International Women's Day. Before you meet our wonderful panel, I'd like to introduce our topic more widely. The theme of this year's International Women's Day is to embrace equity. We all have a role to play within our own circle of influence to actively support and embrace equity by challenging stereotypes. And in fact, we had a very good discussion last year about that very topic. Call out discrimination, draw attention to biases, and seek out inclusion. The United Nations also is completing an observance of International Women's Day with a focus on digital, focusing on innovation and technology and raising awareness that 37% of women globally do not actually use the internet. And that means 250 million have no access to the web at all. The consequences of this digital gender gap may widen economic and social inequalities that we already see today. And it's estimated that by 2050, 75% of all jobs will be in STEM-related fields. So technology is crucial in supporting and empowering women. Our webcast today is titled Just Apply, and it brings these topics together as we discuss gendered language and its broader effects, and some of the technology that may help us in moving closely to bring positive change. The webinar, however, could easily have been called How to Build a Sustainable Business, or even Give Your Business the Competitive Edge. Because in 2019, LinkedIn released a Gender Insights report showing that women were 16% less likely to apply for a role after viewing it, and 26% less likely to ask for a referral, and overall, they apply for 20% less jobs than men, reflecting a very real issue in the recruitment space. We hope today's webinar will make us all more conscious of gendered language and the workplace and its negative effect on individuals and ultimately organisations. As gendered language goes well beyond recruitment and can deter individuals from applying to join internal and external committees, project groups, training programmes, and other forms of professional development, leading to a lack of cognitive diversity in an organisation and limiting an individual's opportunities for career progression. Today, we're going to examine what organisations can do to prevent gender biases within their own internal processes, and secondly, discuss the idea of urging people who feel discouraged by these biases to just apply anyway, and to recognise that biases exist everywhere, including in the recruitment space, and that shouldn't affect their decision. So before we start our discussion, I'd really love to introduce our panel, who are going to actually introduce themselves and give us a little bit of background. So I'm going to just start off with Alex. So good afternoon, Alex.
Thank you so much. Great to be here. So I'm actually a finance lawyer. I've been a lawyer for very many years, first for various international law firms and then for a global investment bank. And I then in 2017 moved into a risk management role where I was designing and implementing controls for the sales and trading division of that investment bank. And whilst the controls were absolutely essential, it became clear to me that actually you can't control everything. And culture change around those controls became a very big part of my role. And that was aligned with the FCA's agenda on transforming culture in financial services. It was also very aligned with my own personal interest in EDI, having founded a parenting network and also been very heavily involved with various gender networks. And ostensibly, I did that to bring people together, but also crucially, to raise awareness at senior management level of some of the challenges which existed and to co-create solutions in order to overcome them. In 2021, I set up my own culture change consultancy, and I now work with a broad range of firms, both within financial services and beyond, firms like yours, where I support the firms with that culture change agenda. And I'm really delighted to be here today to be discussing these very, very important topics, these issues which women still face, and look forward to digging deep on them.
Oh, thank you so much, Alex. We're delighted to have you. Caroline, can I move to you?
Hi there, thank you, Jo, and thank you so much for inviting me to participate today. So I'm Caroline Hughes, I'm Director of an Employment Law and HR Consultancy business based in Central Scotland. So we support SMEs and third sector organisations in the main in all aspects of legal and HR advice, as well as provide consultancy services, including assessment and selection, organisational development and leadership development. I loftily call myself a behavioural scientist, so have a specific interest in data and evidence-based research to help inform and support best practice in all aspects of HR and people-related activity. Really looking forward to today's discussion. Thank you.
We're looking forward to hearing from you as well, particularly in the behavioural science space. Thank you so much. Evie, good afternoon. How are you today? You want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Jo. Good afternoon, everybody. So yeah, I always stop at Iwi because nobody really wants to say my last name, but it's Ugiagby Green. So I am a reader at Manchester Met University. Nobody ever knows what a reader does or is, but essentially I wear 3 hats. So I have teaching responsibilities, which I absolutely love, research responsibilities, and also leadership responsibilities. So I'm an accountant by training. A lapsed accountant, I might argue. My research interests span race equity in student education, student employability, kind of transition of students through the different levels. But obviously my research is grounded in social justice, so I have interests that are much broader than race equity, but that's my specialism, I would say. And I have leadership responsibilities around ensuring that our students get into what's called positive outcomes, so great graduate jobs, or go on to do further postgraduate research or postgraduate taught study. So I'm delighted to be here, something I'm completely passionate about, and I'm sitting in very esteemed company. So thank you very much for the invitation. I look forward to the conversation.
Oh, thank you. Looking forward to hearing more from you during the course of our discussion. Last but not least, Amy, welcome. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Oh, I'd love to. Thank you. Yeah, my name's Amy, Amy Mann. I work at NatWest Group for their talent acquisition function. And I have a quite unique role in the bank in that I write job adverts, or I lead a team who write job adverts and various recruitment content that goes on our websites. And I suppose in terms of today's session, I'm really looking forward to sort of digging in to hear how other people are looking at gendered language, I suppose, in their own adverts, and understanding what more is going on externally, because it's obviously a bigger problem than one that I can tackle alone. So yeah, I'm really excited for today's session.
Thank you so much, Amy. Yeah, you've got a fascinating role, and actually really critical in that introduction when I spoke about, you know, what the UN are talking about with women in technology, and your role actually is making a difference, you know. So I think that's a key thing, that everybody can in their own way make a difference to challenge the norms and do just something positive for good. So thank you so much, panel. So really just going to get onto the discussion and our topics now. There will be an opportunity hopefully to get some questions from our audience as well over the course at the end of the session. But I think the very first thing I want to look at is the whole sort of gendered language and the recruitment space and its impact on personal experiences and things. And Caroline, I wanted to come to you really in this area to talk about what you think the main impacts are through gendered language and sort of with job descriptions, and how these affect people really in the real world.
Sure, let me try and dive in then. So I thought it might be useful just to quickly unpack what we mean by gendered language, as it's very subtle and nuanced. And I guess thinking about job adverts and applications, it's often about what we call the coded language that deters women from applying for roles. So there's a wealth of social science evidence suggesting that the language we use encodes gendered expectations in a way that isn't really obvious to either employers or employees. And these gendered expectations feed into how we hire, how we assess, and how we promote. So some examples of what we call masculine coded words are things like analytical, confident, competitive, and feminine coded are things like agree, collaborate, interpersonal. These are also known as communal and agentic. So when women read a job advert containing words associated with male stereotypes, they can feel like they don't fit the description. So this invisible barrier can stop women from applying. So a recent report by the Behavioural Insights team suggests that the impact of gendered language in job adverts is actually more prominent when applicants feel less qualified for a role. So to put that more simply, men are more likely to throw their hats in the ring than women. Less qualified men perceived that they met the overall requirements for a role to a greater extent than similarly qualified women. Now, interestingly, there was no gender difference among more qualified candidates, suggesting that when women feel confident that they meet or exceed the criteria, they will apply as often as men. But circling back to your question, what impact does this have in the real world? Well, what this suggests is that women are less likely to apply for those stretch roles to the senior positions, and this leads to men entering into better paid and more senior positions earlier in their career and their skills development journey.
Yeah, so that's real serious consequences. And I suppose, Alex, from your other side of the sort of the corporate and the cultural impact of that, what do you think? What do you think for organisations as a whole? What do you see? What do you see the impacts are?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Carolyn has said. And I wonder whether we can also go a little bit further and test some of these assumptions as well. And I think it certainly is true that some women do feel, right, I don't cover off all these skills, so I'm not going to apply. That happens all the time. I also want to look at where women do have that approach where they say, well, I've been encouraged to be braver, to look at things from a slightly different perspective. And they don't cover up all the skills, but they feel they own what they don't know, and they do present themselves well for what they are well qualified for. I would like to have a better conversation around the way that is perceived by those managers, by those senior stakeholders who are actually receiving those applications, whether there is some element of different perceptions where a woman puts herself forward, or somebody who is it's not just about gender, but somebody who is not part of the dominant group, how that is seen by the people who are actually able to make those decisions. And I would like to have a better conversation about that, because I'm sure there are many reasons for that happening, but I think that it's important not just to put the onus on the people from minorities or people who just don't necessarily fit the molds so much, because I think that's where things tend to stall slightly.
I think that's a really important point there about the whole I don't fit in around here, and that for an individual and an organisation looking at the candidates, regardless of their skill sets, I think there is a much bigger a different webinar actually potentially on that whole different topic. Just we can bring you in from your own personal experiences to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I suppose I look at this more as a kind of inclusive leader, with someone who's got responsibilities for both staff and students. And for me, the reason why sort of gendered language is so important is that it's about making people feel seen and feel safe. And that's a broader inclusion issue. So I see gendered language as being part of the kind of inclusion landscape, I suppose. And I look at it from quite a kind of cultural perspective as well, I think. I think the point that was made around the masculine, feminine language is absolutely right, of course. And as Carolyn had said, there's social science research to support that. But I think society has kind of evolved where we've seen gendered language kind of framed as this binary, masculine, feminine thing, to one where now we recognise that there are some cultures, some languages themselves that aren't binary in that sense. So, when we look at Korea, one of my best friends is from Korea. When we look at Thailand, when we look at Finnish language, very, very comfortable in using the person or theirs, and don't have this kind of binary language that we associate with biology and the sexes. And then obviously we've kind of moved into this world where gender expression, gender presentation and identity are much more, accepted and a much more prominent feature who we are and how we are. And so language has to evolve with that so that people feel safe, feel seen, and feel included. And so that's something that I kind of think about in my role. And I think, you know, I've been pulled up a couple of times by students, particularly around the language of gender, with transgender, for example. In my attempts to be inclusive, I've actually upset some students by getting it wrong. And I think it's about sort of accepting that mistakes will be made, but doing the work. And, you know, as Alex says, the onus is on us. It's not on the women who are applying to kind of try and fit and navigate through all of this. It's our responsibility as people who are leaders or recruiters or whatever that might be to do the work. So for me, that's been getting feedback from the students, it's been doing training, it's been putting yourself in quite uncomfortable positions, but recognising that actually we really need that to kind of move forward and to take responsibility for that.
Thanks, Iwi. Amy, would you like to add on anything to this sort of point? Because obviously in the recruitment sector, given your role for what you've seen.
Yeah, so I mean, in financial services, which is obviously my area, we've got a big focus on trying to encourage more women to come and work in our sector. And historically, it hasn't been the most, you know, welcoming area to work for women. And a lot of it's historically been a male-led area, and it's changing now, but you see in the language of our job descriptions, or when I see them every day, it's these male-coded words are just everywhere. And I almost feel it's my responsibility to call those out to the recruiters and the hiring managers and make them aware, because if we're not talking about it and we don't, you know, we call it choosing to challenge. And if we don't choose to challenge that, then nothing's going to change. And we're just sort of in this permeating cycle. So, I mean, just to echo what everyone else has said, I think it's just a case of needing to talk about this with people, men and women, because we all use gender specific words, you know, reflexively. So that, yeah.
No, I love that. Choose to challenge, because you're right. Nothing
is.
If it stays the same. Caroline, I was going to ask you about, you know, this sort of how technology can help in the recruitment space and how it can get used to sort of mitigate against the problems that gendered language creates.
Sure, absolutely. So, I mean, just I guess sticking with the gendered language at the moment in terms of adverts and so on, and I'm sure you'll bring a lot of different aspects to this in discussion later, but just in terms of the sort of gender decoders that are out there, I'm using a word that I haven't introduced yet, but yes, there are. So there are lots of really easy to use tools out there, and Amy, I'm sure you'll use these a lot as well, but there are things online now that exist that you can literally cut and paste your job adverts and your job descriptions, pop it into the gender decoder, and they'll check for these subtly coded languages and words that we've already talked about. So probably one of the most famous ones is a behavioural designer called Kat Matfield, and she created the sort of original gender decoder tool. And there's been a lot of, not, I was going to say jumping on the bandwagon, but people are using these, and other organisations are extrapolating and building on them. So, for example, advertising platforms like Total Jobs have followed suit, and they've included a gender bias decoder, and they've actually got some really nice, easy to digest stats and examples. And if we're thinking about hiring managers and you know, having to persuade and demonstrate, give examples to hiring managers of where this does impact, things like, you know, easy to digest stats on Total Jobs, brilliant to use to actually, you know, to put in front of them and say, no, this is real, this is what's happening. I think Amy might talk about Applied a little bit more. Amy, you possibly use Applied on a daily basis, I think, but Applied is a platform, it's a science-backed recruitment platform that their sole purpose is to to reduce bias and increase diversity. It actually is a spin-off of the behavioural insights team, and they're working super hard to make everything as inclusive as possible. It's an excellent resource. It's an excellent platform. It's got its own built-in decoder, and again, masses of resources that are free for people to look at and use. But maybe Amy, maybe you want to talk a little bit more about Applied and how you find that that helps in your day-to-day role? Sorry if I presumed, but I think you said it.
Well, it is something. It is something that we are looking at. At the moment, we actually use the aptly flawed decoder as well, just because, well, it's free, and I recommend anyone who's on this webinar to use it in their day-to-day tools, whether that's an email, a job advert, or just a message to a colleague. But there are other tools that we're currently looking at NatWest Group to use, which include things like we've got Textio, ePloy, Hemingway Editor, and Grammarly. And these are all AI tools that essentially provide real-time feedback on your writing and essentially interrupt your bias in real time. And the way they work is there are data insights and metrics based on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And as it's analysing your whatever you've written, in my case, a job advert, it in real time shows you the language that you're using that's perhaps gender coded, suggests alternative words that can be used. And these are all types of tools that come at a price. But to go back to Carolyn, what you were saying about the aptly flawed decoder tool, that's free and it's so simple to use, and the findings that we get from that, like I say, we feed back to hiring managers and we feed it back to the recruiters so that we can build their awareness, but also show them the words and the terminology that they might be using every day and not even thinking about, and kind of the impact and connotations those words can have on female applicants.
That's a really good point. What about the people that are doing the sort of coding behind the scenes? Amy, have you ever had any interactions in that area?
Yeah, so I'm really interested in that as an area, because obviously artificial intelligence systems operate and learn from the data it's given. And if the data is generated and collected from humans, it's going to carry all the same biases that we have. And that includes bias towards women. And as a result, we're developing technologies that are actually going to reinforce that inequality when we're looking to use them as a solution in the long term. So I think the key comes back to representation and making sure that the people who are, pulling these algorithms, and I'm not very technical, so that might not be the right terminology, but people who are involved in that needs to be representative of society. And a really good example of how that isn't the case is the Oxford Dictionary. So the Oxford Dictionary was written something like 150 odd years ago now, but it was written by men, or the editors were men, the people paying for the dictionary were men. There are a few women who were sort of daughters and wives of editors, but they had no decision-making power. And for words to be included in the dictionary, its reference had to be written in print. So over 90% of those references were written by men. So the dictionary itself is gendered text, and that's why it's so important that when we're looking at bringing this into technology and having hiring decisions made on it, it has to be gendered language, has to be a main focus, and looking at how we interpret and how we react to certain language in adverts and in everyday language as well.
So I think I'd quite like to ask this to the whole panel, see who's got a view in it. So does it mean that for, like, if we're talking about the recruitment space and adverts, should it be that the adverts are sort of gender unbiased, or is it feminine coded? What's the sort of feel for that? If anybody's got any thoughts on that, what should we be aiming for here?
I'll have a go at that one if you like, Jo.
Yeah, and I'll come to Yui after that. Yeah.
Oh,
Caroline.
sorry, you. Yeah,
No, no, go.
it's a really interesting question. So the research to date suggests that men aren't actually significantly affected one way or another by the inclusion of more communal female coded language in job adverts. So, you know, on one hand, you could say, well, that suggests that you just use female coded words all the time because men aren't affected. Is that fair? I don't know. We'll open that up. I think it's about achieving balance. I think it's about, you know, using gender neutral language as much as possible, particularly with job titles, and equal weighting to male and female coded descriptors. Interesting, there's a lot of evidence around the use of trait terms as well versus behavioural terms, so not just the coding. And so what that means is asking a candidate, you know, so if in a job description you say a candidate is analytical, that's a trait, that's a personality trait. And that can be off-putting apparently to women. So maybe using something more behavioural, like you will be able to analyse data, so that's a behavioural term rather than a trait term, is more inclusive and more communal. So it's not even just as nuanced as the coded language, it's the way you phrase it as well. I mean, ultimately, I think I'd be suggesting that if you've got the capacity and the resources, test it out, experiment, do randomized experiments using different approaches to find out what works for your organisation and what doesn't.
Really, really good points there, Carol. Thank you so much. Iwi, I think you had some thoughts on the positioning.
Yeah, this might sound a little bit controversial, but it is something that got me thinking. I don't know if anybody had read about the high school in Sheffield that got into bits of hot water recently with an advert that it put out. So it was an advert for an assistant head teacher role, and people got very hot under the collar because I've got a few quotes actually from the advert. It asked for somebody who was wedded to the role, someone who works ridiculously hard, someone who rolls up their sleeves, is a doer and a grafter. And there were various other traits and behavioural language that was used in the advert. And it really got me thinking, because I know if I was applying for a job and I saw that, I would not expect that organisation to be inclusive, right? So I am not going to apply. And I think there is something around, as Caroline says, the words that we use and how we use them, but actually we use language in a very purposeful and often political way. And I think if you are being disingenuous, right, if you are using this balanced approach, which is what we would ideally like to see, but actually when you apply for that job and the interview process is horrendous, or, you know, when you're onboarded or you get in and it's just, you know, there needs to be an authenticity to the language that's being used, I think, and it's a bit of a fine balance. But as I say, I would take from an advert like that, or an advert that might be deemed overtly masculine, for want of a better expression, that's not going to be a place where I'm going to feel safe, and therefore it's not going to be a place that I want to apply to. And so it's a bit of a provocation, really, I suppose, in thinking that these things are quite nuanced, and what we might see is like the optimum might not actually be in real terms what we need, if that makes sense.
I also wonder about the impact of that on organisations themselves, because actually, you know, if they go down that route and they've got this criteria that built, they're just missing the opportunity with so many other great candidates, you know, that could work for them. Yeah, Alex, I knew you would be like, oh,
yeah,
about that.
I think that's a really, really important point. And I think I'm very conscious, I hope I'm not saying anything controversial here, that a lot of us in the room today are people who feel that we want to do our best, that we want awareness to be raised around these issues, so that organizations, and ultimately the work I do, is to facilitate organizations to think about how to get to the best outcomes and best decision makings. And this is the reason why we want to do it. We want to be sensible. I'm also acutely aware that there will be some people who are outside of that discussion who do not think that way, and who might think that this is becoming quite an extreme world where nobody can say anything anymore, and there's a huge politicization involved. Now, there are all sorts of agendas, I think, which feed into that, and I don't really want to go down that rabbit hole. But I wonder whether it's really important to take that step back and remind ourselves why we care about this and why it's important. Again, going back to the better decision making, better outcomes, for those people who are maybe outside of the conversation and who feel that they feel comfortable with that affinity, with that similarity, and they don't want to go beyond their comfort zone, that actually we live in a world where carrying on working that way opens us up to risk. The reason we want to have more diverse candidates, the reason we want to have cognitive diversity. So I'm not talking about tokenism. I'm not talking about people who may be from different groups, but are actually exactly the same as the dominant group and have worked hard to be like that in order to be accepted. I'm talking about people who really have those different perspectives, so that those people, when they are around, when they're in a meeting, when they're in a group, which is actually making decisions, they can see things from different perspectives and actually take a better decision as a consequence of that, so that they can better serve the communities that they are there to provide a service for. I mean, that doesn't always play terribly well in financial services when they say, well, our buy side looks exactly the same as us. But I think that the real argument there is actually what got us to here is not going to get us to there. We live in an increasingly complex world. You do need to have those different perspectives now, because if you don't, what you run the risk of is that there will be a whole narrative going on outside of your organization and you are not part of it. So very much, we want to have that cognitive diversity. We want to attract the best candidates in order to be able to see things in a much more holistic way and to drive better outcomes and better decision making. Because I'm really concerned sometimes that we do try our best to do the right thing, but sometimes we leave certain people behind, and it's quite important to take them with us and to remind ourselves why this is important.
Yeah, I think it's a crucial point, isn't it? That we need allies, we need everybody involved in it, but we also need that commercial imperative that actually you're doing this for great business reasons as well. You know, if you want to be, if you want your business to be sustainable in future, you know, people have got a voice. The internet has given so much of a voice to people in groups and activism of all sorts. So, you know, people watch organizations and what they're doing. So as we pointed out, I'd be interested to know who got the job in Sheffield. Or if there was any applicants anyway. I suppose maybe on that point, and because we're in a moment in time, but actually what does all of this really mean for the next generation? Like for the younger people coming through now, do they have the same perception of it, or you know, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, as I pointed out, I'm lucky enough to work with, you know, lots of students and have done for a long time, and I think there's a few things really. I think we know from research that Generation Z, if that's what you want to call them, you know, the younger talent pipeline coming through, are very, very values-based in their decision making. They're sort of less driven by monetary reward and what informs their thinking, how they see the world, where they want to be in the world, how they see themselves, etc. is very much driven by social purpose, and they look at organisations and the extent to which, you know, organisations are aligned with some of that. It's not everything, obviously. Cost of living crisis, clearly people want money, but it is something that, you know, my students do think about in their decision making. And I think there's also the context of the graduate market at the moment. So the UK, Universities UK, published a report last year. It's called Busting Graduate Job Myths. And basically they pointed out that it's a graduates market. There's a 1 million graduate jobs gap in terms of demand and supply. And I hear anecdotally from companies that I work with of graduates holding on to like 5 offers, you know, and then deciding who they're going to go with and not turning up for jobs that they've been offered. And so I think there's a lot of agency that graduates now have. So alongside with that kind of social purpose, values driven decision making, I think, you know, students, graduates, they vote with their feet. basically. And if organisations are getting this wrong, as we've said, it's a business imperative, but if you get this wrong, you are not going to attract the talent that you want to see. And I think it's obviously important for everybody, but as I say, equally, you know, social norms around those things I spoke about before, like gender expression, identity, you know, presentation, it's hugely important that when graduates are applying for jobs, it is about the values of the organisation, but it's also about them as people. And are they going to feel safe? Are they going to want to stay? Are they going to have the work-life balance they want to see, etc.? And so the coding that Carolyn spoke about and the language that's used, not just to attract them, but to keep them, you know, is hugely important. And I'll just end, because I know Alex would like to come in, just by saying I had a conversation with one of my graduates. He works here in Manchester for Deloitte. He works in the sports analyst team. Sounds like an amazing job. And they've just recruited for graduates for next year. And he was saying one of the 4 that they've recruited is a South African medical student. And talking to a colleague, there seems to be an increasing trend kind of in financial services, professional services, of recruiting more globally at graduate early talent pipeline level, you know. And so coming back to what I'd said around kind of the cultural norms, because we're socialized, right? And that's why in Britain, in England, we have this thing around kind of gendered language and how we see that. But as I say, for some cultures, actually, that's not a thing. And if you're wanting to attract talent from those markets, again, it's just part of what we were talking about in terms of you isolate and exclude people if you are not inclusive in the language that you are using. And it should be a business imperative to get the best talent in. So, yeah.
You've actually just answered a question that someone has sent in as well, which is about the impact in the younger generation and the impact that they can have on organisations being conscious of gendered language. So I think you're absolutely spot on, and thank you for answering that. I might bring in another question from the audience actually in a wee minute, but before I'll do so. Alex, did you have a point that you wanted?
I just wanted to follow up on that, because again, I agree with all of that. I think it's so important. I think there are certain young people I've met who don't fall into that category of being very focused on values. They're usually people who have felt that they were part of the benefit of their parents' generation, and they've gone to elite institutions and they feel that they want to be part of that. But I would say that they, whilst they exist, there are a lot of people who do feel differently. And I think one of the big disconnects between speaking as a classic Gen Xer as opposed to a Gen Zer is when I first started work, I felt that I had to succeed in the organization I started in. And if I didn't, the alternative was sleeping in a cardboard box under Waterloo Bridge. I mean, that's a rather extreme version, but it illustrates the point that the Generation Z that's coming up now really do feel that they have options. And the point you made earlier, Joanne, is the internet has given so much more access to information. And I think it's really important when older people are managing the younger generation that's coming through, that they don't see things in the same way as people who are older. And that sense of, well, I came through the ranks, I worked incredibly hard, I didn't need to have all these additional things that the younger generation seems to feel is important. You know, that creates a very significant disconnect, and you will lose them. And that creates massive turnover and disruption for in a bad way for an organization. So it is really, really important to think critically about how you keep them on board.
So that's interesting, because we've actually got another audience question where they're saying, what do the panel think is the biggest challenge that organisations are facing when they're tackling this gendered language? But Alex, your point is it's much bigger and wider than the problem.
Absolutely. And I think that it's just important. People have different perspectives, and we want to encourage those perspectives. Unfortunately, as a human race, the reason we survive for so long is because we seek affinity in the people who are like us and similar to us. There's a whole herd instinct around that, which I know Carolyn will be able to speak better than I can on. But it's important to remember why it exists. and why we're constantly seeking it, but then actually thinking that doesn't really help us in the 21st century to solve 21st century problems. It helps us with problems when we were predated by large animals and we had very little security in terms of survival. So I think it's really important to remember that we do want to have better conversations. That's not always easy. In fact, it can be very challenging sometimes. But those different perspectives which make us feel uncomfortable can actually unlock quite a lot of the solutions that we're seeking. And that's the reason why it's important for us to overcome those barriers.
Has anybody else got anything they want to add in response to that audience question about the biggest challenge faced by organisations when it comes to tackling gendered language and specifically? If not, Caroline, I've got another audience question. I'm going to take the audience questions now because I'm so conscious of time. I think we might not get to them at the end. So I'm thinking as they come in, I'm just going to give them because they run through the conversation anyway. But one of the questions specifically, Caroline, for you was whether do you think that we've got a long way to go before gendered language isn't a problem in the workplace? Or is it always just going to be there?
Oh gosh, good question. My instinct is to say yes, it probably will always be there. And things like this kind of conversation and raising awareness will go some way to supporting that. But what I would say is I think that we need to be very mindful. I mean, one of my mantras about improving equality is that we need to de-bias systems, not people. And I think that's really important in that space because human decision making is prone to unconscious bias. There is just no question of that. And no matter how well intentioned we may be, that will continue. So, and as Alex said, cognitive bias exists, and in many situations it helps us. It helps us as humans to process all of this information that's coming at us every second of every day, but we're no longer being predated by saber-toothed tigers. So what do we do with that? And you can't simply train that out. I guess I'm talking about, unconscious bias training and those kind of things. You just can't train that out. There's also evidence to suggest that unconscious bias training can have a bit of a backfire effect. I'm just using that as one example in terms of that question. And I guess I'm thinking that, I'm not suggesting that you don't include awareness training and as part of your toolkit, but there's just such a broad range of things that we're going to have to do. Yes, make issues of language and its consequences as explicit as possible, but I think it's about paying attention to your processes, using gender decoders, making sure your criteria is tight, lacking in ambiguity, anonymise applications, use workplace scenarios to screen rather than CVs, baking all of these elements into your processes to minimise that human error. But will we always get rid of it? Possibly not for the foreseeable future, but yeah, I could be wrong.
I think we had a conversation, Ewan and I have had a conversation the last year actually, about the very topic, because bias is just everywhere. It's your born with that you're raised. It's part of it's built in. So yeah, but
but you can change the process. You can tighten the process. Yeah,
absolutely, around about that.
I hope that answers that to some extent. Probably not.
Yeah, definitely has given us all food for thought. Amy, I've got another question for you about whether your role has given you the opportunity then to open up more sort of conversations around different aspects of diversity in the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have, as I mentioned, we have something called Choose to Challenge, which is where we're all encouraged across the bank at NatWest Group to challenge bias, or if something doesn't feel right, we need to talk about it and make it part of the conversation. And by looking at gender bias and gendered language in our job adverts, it's opened that up to various types of diversity, from socioeconomic diversity, making sure that our customers are from all walks and backgrounds in life, and it's important that the people serving them and helping them on a day-to-day reflect those people too. So it's not just, in terms of gender, it is around all aspects of diversity, be it, race, religion, sexuality, age is a big one at the moment that we're looking at, because obviously we've got an aging workforce, and we need to be careful that the language we're using in adverts isn't going to be off-putting to them as well. Things like active and, there's all sorts of words. And I think because language, it can be so subtle, but it does push us to kind of imagine the type of person that someone's talking about in a role, and it might also then discourage other people from seeking it. And that's, to bring it to this conversation, is women. And so, yeah, it's definitely opened up the conversation, not just obviously in our recruitment content, but broadly, whether it's day-to-day conversations with each other as colleagues, with our customers or stakeholders. And yeah, just talking about it and challenging it when we see it in front of us.
One quick audience question, Amy, for you is just whether you think there's been changes towards gendered language in the last 5 years. So whether you've seen any changes sort of in the recruitment process, do you think that's improved? As opposed to the very fact that your role exists and your team exists?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, my team, we write job adverts. We don't decode every single advert. We've got lots of jobs that have an advert pre-written, and sometimes we just amend it to make it more specific to the role. And when we were writing those templates, we use the gender decoder then. Whereas now, when we have new roles coming through, we'll still do that on like a case-by-case basis. And I would say that particularly in senior leadership roles and STEM, so those areas where we have got a lot of focus on improving the diversity of people who fill those roles, there's almost like it's hard to put it into words, but there's just kind of mind blank. There's still a lot that we can do, but there is progress, particularly in those roles where we've used the decoder, and the feedback that we get and the evidence we're seeing is really positive. And some of the greatest advocates we have are from some of our male senior leaders who proactively come to us now and say, can you make sure you use the gender decoder, because I want to make sure that the candidates we're shortlisting are diverse. And we are seeing that link between adverts that have been written to either be neutral or more attractive to women, and then the diversity of the shortlist. And that's really positive, but there's still a lot more to do. And again, it comes to looking at the moment we use technology as a tool, but if we are looking to use technology as more of a solution to this, again, going back to what we were talking about earlier, it comes to representation and making sure that the people who are, building this technology are diverse too.
And that's great to hear, though, that the hiring managers are active in these conversations as well, because that's what we do need. We need the whole organisation thinking like that. In fact, I'm just conscious of time. We could have probably done with 2 hours to talk about all of this. I want to move on to just talking about this concept of just applying. So recognising that there's bias everywhere, but just go ahead and sort of apply anyway. So Iwi, just to bring you into this, do you see it as a concept that there are any sort of pitfalls, or that we need to be careful when we're encouraging people to sort of see past the bias?
Yeah, it's probably no surprise for everyone. It's something I quite caution against. I think, speaking to Alex's point earlier about where the onus sits, where the responsibility sits, it's not on the candidate to put themselves at risk. It's the organisation to know how they want to position themselves, what they want to say about who they are and what they do, and having ownership over that. And as somebody who supports students and graduates, my overriding concern is their psychological safety. And I think it's a red flag, So I think there's decisions that students or graduates would need to make that need to be informed. So obviously the language tells you one thing. You do your research around the organisation. You know, organisations have reputations. You can speak to people who work there, perhaps have access to those sorts of avenues to get a better sense of kind of the culture of the organisation, and not just kind of relying on the words that they're using. But there's certainly a degree of self-preservation, I would say, that I think needs to be the priority when you're thinking about the potential trade-offs, because nothing's perfect, obviously, and there are things that you gain or lose by making that decision, and it will be a very personal thing. But as somebody, you know, in a position of authority, I suppose, supporting those students, that their safety is absolutely the thing that I see as paramount. And I think sometimes organisations can forget just how much of themselves actually graduates put into recruitment and selection processes. And I say this as someone who gets so frustrated about people who don't get back to graduates through the process, you know, about where they are, or give them feedback or things like that. And I think I make the point around that because they invest so much of themselves. And I think particularly if you're marginalised or minoritised, which are, you know, where I do a lot of my research, as I say, there's a huge cognitive load that comes with trying to navigate all of this. There's all this hidden stuff that sometimes people who are a bit more privileged or who have access to these networks can kind of help with their decision making around those trade-offs. If you're marginalised, minoritized, you don't have that social capital and you don't have that knowledge. And you also enter into this kind of identity politics. You know, we hear about people code switching and trying to kind of modify their behaviours to fit in with the kind of dominant group or what it is they think the organisations are looking for. And it's hugely harmful. And I come back to the point about it being hugely disingenuous if you're not using language that reflects the culture of your organisation. And the responsibility, as I say, is not on the student or graduate to second guess that. It's on the organisation.
Thanks, Huey. Alex, could I just bring you in here from a wider, we sort of touched on the wider the recruitment point, but obviously for the whole promotion, everything else, everything that people can be involved in. But how can we encourage people just to apply and to move away from the blame being it's their fault that they don't fit that mold, and focus on issues within the organisation more widely?
And I think Iwi makes the point at graduate level, but I think it carries on throughout the life cycle of any individual. It carries on further up the chain. And a lot of the work I do is actually raising awareness with people who actually fundamentally want to do the right thing, but are just simply not aware of, because they've always had that social capital, they fitted in neatly. I mean, I can think of various instances in my own career. I think it's important to different people get treated differently. I have sat in meetings where, or also in recruitment interviews, where somebody who does not, and I'm not saying anything I suspect that people will be surprised by, but somebody who does not fit that mold will be given a very difficult time when they're being interviewed. And I think to say to them, just apply, is one thing, but I think it's really important to raise that awareness for the people around the room who may be, going to Carolyn's point about being having this unconscious bias, which is normal, but to say it is normal to have it. We're not blaming you for having it, but this is actually what is stopping you from having, Amy, that point, that having that more diverse team that you're actually seeking. So please be aware that this could be playing into some of the work, some of the interactions which are actually happening around your table. So yes, apply, be brave, own the fact that you may have gaps, but that's okay. Managers, be aware that these biases are going to come into play. And also, if you've got somebody who has got huge potential but doesn't actually have the skill set yet, support them, because what you also want to avoid is setting people up to fail, because that sends a very powerful message to other people in the organization. Oh yes, we know about X who tried for that role, they stayed in it for 3 months and then had a nervous breakdown. again, I'm talking about quite extreme circumstances, but I have seen those instances happen, and not just once. So it's very much a multifaceted approach to, yes, we have to encourage people to be brave, but then we have to put in place the infrastructure to support that bravery, because everybody loves plug and play. I mean, again, it's human nature. It's brilliant. I recruit somebody exactly like me, thinks like me, they can do the job, off we go. But am I getting those diverse views? Am I serving those communities that my team is meant to be providing a service for? Potentially not. Am I managing my risk effectively by doing this? No. So there are all sorts of pieces that need to be put in place, I think.
So we have, thank you so much, panel. We have 5 minutes literally left. And I've got one final audience question that I didn't manage to get into. And they actually asked the whole panel. We won't have time for that, but it would be really good if even one of you could maybe give us an example where you've actually personally had this challenge and that there has been a positive outcome. Would that be something that anybody would like to share? Putting you on the spot. I don't know if that's something instantly you can come up with. We might be able to do answers later on and follow up to the webinar. No.
Jo, I'm not sure I quite understand the question.
So one of the questions, sorry, was, have we got examples to share at a time that we've challenged something and it's had a positive outcome?
Okay.
Sorry, that's a better position than that. Thank you for clarifying that.
I'm happy to give 30 seconds worth on that. Actually challenging, and to Amy's point earlier about challenging bias, is incredibly difficult to do. To do well requires a lot of careful, considered approaches. And I would say that it's something not maybe to do in the moment necessarily, because if you get it wrong, it can close down the conversation completely for a long time to come. So I would say challenging to do it, and often to do it maybe not in the moment, but there are a lot of ways you can do it coming in from the side. So where you hear somebody maybe saying something which is offensive or which clearly is loaded with meaning that was potentially unintended, coming in from the side can be very effective, saying, look, I know, and I have done this, I know you didn't mean it, not in front of the whole group, but saying, I know you didn't mean it, but that comment you made just now really didn't land in the right place, and I wouldn't want you to get into trouble over it. That can be highly effective. But again, it does require careful thought when you challenge these points.
Caroline, do you want to make a point there?
Just a really quick point, and it's maybe slightly off piste, but I think what's been really interesting, and we're talking about, challenging things, but actually what we're talking about in all this subtlety of language and job adverts and things is that so many applicants will never actually realise that that's what put them off. So I don't quite know where to go with that, but I think that's a point that we need to make, is that all of this is really interesting, but unless a candidate knows that they've been put off, what will they do about it?
Hopefully maybe watch our webinar.
Exactly. And I think just a couple of lines on an advert, maybe just by way of explanation or pointing to some more information in the background on an intranet site or a recruitment platform, explaining that exactly this kind of thing may well help.
I actually, Amy, am I right? The adverts now that you actually encourage people, even if they don't feel they've got the full skills and knowledge that they're asking for, that they actually say that now.
Yeah, so we've started incorporating that into our adverts, and essentially just encouraging people, if you don't feel that you have 100% of the requirements, but you feel that actually you're the right person for the role, or you've got, another aspect that you can bring to it, like apply, because what's the worst that's going to happen? That's kind of my attitude to it, and that's how we're trying to encourage women, especially into the bank, but all types of people from various backgrounds. So I think, just like as Alex was saying, the best way to confront unconscious bias is just to force ourselves to be aware that it actually just exists all the time, and it's around us all the time, and it's built into the language we use day to day. And challenge yourself as well when you find yourself saying, hi guys, or that's a 2-man job. Publicly correct yourself, and you'll start to change who you're thinking of when you talk about that as well.
Amy, thank you. Brilliant last words. Thank you so much, panel. That was the quickest hour. Thank you so much to our audience for joining us today. I hope you've gained lots of useful things to think about and reflect on. And I'd just like to thank my colleagues at the Institute, so Nick and Melissa, for pulling everything together for us all today. So I hope you've enjoyed the event. And thank you again, ladies. And I hope you enjoy the rest of International Women's Day. Thank you.